I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And imagine spending years of your life in service to a clear mission, surrounded by people who would literally die for you, only to suddenly find yourself thrust back into civilian life, trying to explain experiences that most people can't begin to understand. Our guests this week have spent 5 years collecting stories from veterans and their spouses about this critical and often under-discussed transition, showing not just how we can better support those who've served, but what their experiences can teach all of us about finding purpose after profound change. Rob Sarver is a former Navy SEAL. Assigned to SEAL Team 3, he completed 7 deployments during his service. Rob's awards and decorations include the Bronze Star Medal with a Combat V device and oak leaf cluster, and the Combat Action Ribbon with a Gold Star device. Rob is the co-founder of Servius Group and serves as the co-CEO and co-founder of The Hero's Journey. Alex Gendzier is a partner at a top law firm where he is involved in veterans affairs. At his prior firm, he acted as a senior advisor to the VALOR Group, which provides pro bono legal services to veterans and their families, and where he led his law firm's efforts to assist Afghan allies and friends. Rob, Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Well, I'm glad that it's a pleasure all around. Nearly 200,000 men and women become veterans each year as they leave the military, a process known as the military to civilian transition. And many struggle during this transition. At the most extreme end of the spectrum, between 6,000 and 8,000 veterans die by suicide in the U.S. each year, or roughly 22 per day, a rate about 72% higher than Americans who did not serve. A cousin of mine in Afghanistan received 2 Purple Hearts, and all of the men from his battalion who received Purple Hearts alongside him at one of those ceremonies, all of them, except for my cousin, went on to take their own lives. And I've heard some of these difficult stories from my cousin. So I know that veterans are being underserved and undersupported. So I just want to start us off, Alex and Rob, by saying that I truly appreciate what you're doing here, and I appreciate your time today.
Thank you for that. That means a lot.
From the preface of the book, you write, quote, "We are not attempting to tell you what to do. You have likely taken orders your whole career, and the last thing you want to do is read a book written by a naval officer and a lawyer full of do this, not that," end quote. Rob, if this is not a do this, not that book, what is it?
Alex and I recognize that we are standing on the shoulders of giants who've gone for us and folks that have served their country in a lot of ways that dwarf what Alex and I have done. This is a book that Alex and we have gone out for the last 5 years and synthesized all the reading, the blogs, the research, and compiled it into the one-stop shop practical manual for them to get out. We are the messengers. And we use a lot of veterans' voices to tell the stories and to tell their own experiences. So it's not myself and Alex telling people what to do.
It's a collection of knowledge that you've gathered over the last half decade.
Yes.
Alex, you wrote that this book is an example of a, quote, rare military-civilian partnership, end quote. Can you walk us through what that partnership looked like and how your respective backgrounds complemented each other through the process of writing this book?
Yeah, great question. And it's core to what the last 5 years have been like and a key ingredient in our book. Rob and I met through work and because I was also reaching out to get guidance and help. I've got 2 sons that are central to my life, and the older one wanted to go to the Naval Academy where Rob graduated, and my older son needed guidance about it, and Rob was phenomenal and quickly became his mentor, as a result of which we all developed close relationships. The nature of our partnership is both unique and utterly available to the rest of the country. We have a shared sense, I think, of what's involved in major life transitions. We have brought to the book, we hope, a sense of humility about our own lives and where we have fallen down and attempted to pick ourselves up. These experiences, these senses of ourselves, I think, in combination with a devotion to serving veterans and their spouses, led to this partnership. We begin with, therefore, a shared sense of humanity and common life experience, despite the fact that we come from utterly different backgrounds. I never had the honor of serving in the military. I proudly call myself a military dad, but I have not had that, and I've been quite privileged in depending on it for all the reasons we know. Rob and I began to talk about these things in these lights and found common reactions between us, but also the need to explain things to each other from each of our different worlds. So we didn't take things for granted the way a civilian would write a book or the way a veteran would write a book. We had to go down and break things down to their most essential elements. And then in doing so, we found the roots of the book. We found the way to go do interviews, to go test our theories, to go have to justify our work to each other. The nature of that experience, that partnership, we believe is not so common in the world of veterans' books. And I think it has resulted in the ways we have written the book. But I think it is also a microcosm, we believe, of how civilians and veterans can work together. So there's a lot there that we think is worth paying attention to.
Rob, to build on something Alex just said there, was there a moment when the two of you were collaborating on this book where Alex's perspective as a civilian, as someone who hadn't served, kind of changed or affected your perspective as you were kind of looking at this book through your own eyes as someone who has served?
Yes, another great question. Alex is really, to his credit, was the one that took a step back and realized that, Rob, we have lived very different lives, but there's universal themes, the success, tragedy, failures. There's common humanity in all of us, the things that we've been through. And having these massive life transitions, there's commonality in that. And Alex recognized this. So he was the one that took a step back and said, Rob, if you're already helping veterans on the side, they're reaching out to you through LinkedIn for help and you're mentoring them. Why don't we formalize this into a manual or book to help veterans? And at first, I was a little skittish on that, given just how many books are out there written by SEALs. But we went forward with really several guiding criteria from some of the 4 stars that we worked with. But we wanted to write as co-authors to dilute some of the SEAL brand. And we wanted to expand past special operations to the broader military, and then really to even go beyond to first responders. And then anyone who has been through a massive life transition or tragedy could pick this up and find a framework that they could apply to their own lives.
What you just said there, Rob, diluting the SEAL brand, something about that. I imagine there is a lot of wisdom to be garnered from specificity of like, hey, I've done exactly what you've done. But I imagine that with some of that specificity, you might be leaving some people out along the way who could also use help. So it sounds like there was an active consideration there to make this book as broad as it could be to apply to as many servicemen and women as possible.
Yes, you're absolutely right, because we all serve the same why. We all serve for the Constitution, and we're all in service of that. And we're all in service of each other to succeed in our own respective jobs. The how and the what was what I decided to go on and do and be a part of that all volunteer force and go through that excruciating training to go serve amongst, the ranks of the SEALs. That was my personal desire, but my why is just the same as anybody else in any other service, in any other specialty within the military.
You spoke with over 200 veterans and their spouses during the course of writing this book. And there was one quote from former U.S. Navy seaman apprentice Dustin Bennite that stood out as particularly emblematic. He said, quote, "The most painful thing during the transition was that I had a massive void. I literally felt empty. My purpose was gone," end quote. And Rob, you've said that after you completed your service, quote, "It probably took me 2 years to find a baseline of normal. And then I started going through all these life challenges. Offset from my baseline, very different from combat, new terrain. So I had to go back and get help," end quote. Did you personally experience any of what Dustin describes?
Yes, the void, it's the loss of identity, the loss of community. We were all called to the adventure in our own way to go to service. We leave this known world, we go into this unknown universe. But when we come back, we're leaving all these great things behind. This purpose, this service, this community, this identity that I've built by wearing this uniform and the camaraderie, the cohesion, just the teamwork that I had next to the person standing next to me. And then the next day, it's all gone. To fill that void, veterans, we get stuck in this trap of trying to recreate that. We can't recreate it. We have to go back and pick the best things from it and try to go forward and try to find the things that emulate that the best. So there is a massive void that we try to fill. And largely, we need to have self-realization. We might have to fix ourselves first.
And Alex, as I was reading through this book, these questions of how do we find identity? How do we find purpose? How do we find meaning? These obviously aren't questions that only veterans ever ask themselves. Like I myself have been to therapy. I struggle with depression and anxiety over the course of my life. I have many friends who have as well, who are not veterans. These are questions that we all ask ourselves. And it feels like there was a lot in this book that is specifically geared towards veterans and their spouses. I mean, there was lingo that I had to look up and be like, all right, what exactly does that mean? But at the end of the day, I feel like this is really a universal book that can be applied to anyone's life, whether or not they've served.
100%. 100%. This is a life transition book that is in service of veterans, their spouses, and families. However, the lessons from this work, from veterans' voices, from our analysis, the interviews, the research, can be universally applied. We have sent our book to people that have nothing to do with the military, and they have said it has helped them enormously. This has been a labor of immense love for Rob and me for 5 years because we have day jobs that we're committed to, that are serious, and we love. We fit it in the mornings and the evenings and weekends. And I'm sitting there one night thinking about these veteran stories and these life transitions. And I think, well, man, maybe this book and its lessons from people who've come before us can help the guy that loses his wife to cancer. And he's left with 2 kids that are small. And then that guy goes through a life transition when he has devoted himself to that mission and they go off to college. Or when he decides he really needs to change jobs, he's not in the right place. And that's an enormous dislocation. Changing jobs is not dealing with death and loss and grieving, but it's a life transition dislocation. And then I think, okay, that's brilliant. But I'm talking to myself, do you realize that's you? Do you realize this applies to you? And if it applies to you, it applies to everyone. It applies to everyone in our country and of course beyond that, because dealing with life transitions, dealing with loss and having to find purpose in your life are universal themes. And we have found that from the perspective of, if you will, life mastery and coaching and learning from people who are wise, there are better ways to do these things and there are ways that are less successful. And part of our mission has been to capture those things that are, of course, universal, that apply to everyone, but we've learned from this context. So you've hit on a very important point.
Yes, and I come from a creative background myself. I work in film and advertising. And one recurring theme that I see either throughout my work or my friends' work is that so often when we create art, and a book is in its own way very much a work of art, we create art that we need or that we wish we had. And so it seems in many ways, and I imagine this speaks for you as well, Rob, you're writing this book not only for other people who need it now or people who will need it in the future as they become veterans, but also it feels like you wrote the book that you wish you had at some phase of your own lives.
Yes. In keeping with the reference of art, I would say that what I hope we've provided, and again, I wish I had this looking back as I was getting out, is this is something that will help veterans control their own narrative and control their own story. We feel there's enough frameworks in there. There's enough people that have gone before us and the voices that we bring forward to tell their own stories, that this could be something that could help educate the veteran and help them craft their own narrative to go refine purpose as they leave the military.
I would add to that in a way that I hope reflects the voices of veterans and not us talking about our book, but every veteran we interviewed and then showed the book to get feedback, which was a constant exercise, has said to us, I wish I had had this. And even for the folks who've been out for a few decades, there were 3 Vietnam veterans we spoke with, very moving conversations, powerful conversations. They have said, this actually has helped me in a way that I was not expecting. So yes, this is a book we believe that fills a void in the many books about psychology or veterans or stories. And there's many good ones out there, and there's some ones that are not as effective. But yes, we believe this is a practical guide in a way that many folks say, this is helping me and I wish I'd had it.
Rob, there was an interview that you and Alex did with CBS New York last year. In that interview, you said, quote, everything we do in the military is we train for a mission, for a cause. Why not train to get out? We're just kind of left to our own devices, end quote. My question is, why? Because the military has been aware for a long time of how veterans can struggle and suffer after their service ends. They're aware of the extreme end of that suffering, obviously the stark suicide statistic I mentioned earlier, but they must also be aware of how veterans also struggle to find identity, community, and purpose. And I don't know how to ask this question in a non-provocative way, but I'm just going to ask it. Why does this book need to exist in the first place? Why isn't a version of it already being imparted by the military to servicemen and women in the last 6 to 12 months before they're discharged? Because this book is helping to fill a clear and obvious void. But my question is, why does it need to be filled in the first place?
That's a great question. And Alex and I, we've thought about this let's take a step back and just look at the numbers of how many veterans there are. We call it a problem. Let's call it how large the problem is. There's 22 million veterans alive today. That is not counting spouses and children, which I believe is somewhere around another 14 million. There's 250,000 veterans getting out every year. The systems that the government, the DoD, they have in place, the Veterans Affairs, they are good. They're good programs, but the problem is so large. They can't deal with the massive people coming out of the military every year. And then you have 20 years of, asymmetric warfare that we just went through. They cannot help everybody. So, and then you look at, I believe there's over 40,000 nonprofits to help veterans. So all of these systems are coming to help these veterans. And what we hope is we've kind of flown over 100,000 feet and picked the very best frameworks and resources and everything to help those veterans. But we would love to have this book issued out to every service member that is at that 12 to 6 month critical mark before getting out.
Let me add to that. This is so essential. Look, without a doubt, we love our country and we are devoted to our government. But the issues that Rob identified are simply too big for any government to solve. When the focus of the military is necessarily training people to defend the country and defending the country at the highest level, then in a way that we understand, there's less resources that go to folks getting out. But that's a tragedy. And no criticism of the folks running the VA, the Department of Defense, the Department of Labor. But when the transition assistance programs of the different branches are jammed in a few days and run by folks that are not trained, that don't have the background necessary, then what goes in is what comes out in terms of quality and effect and impact on veterans. So we think about the quote that we found from General Washington upon his leaving his command, and he said, "Our country will be judged by how it treats its veterans, and we need to do better." And this has been an enormous source of motivation on our side because we think we can make a difference. It's up to us, it's up to you to make a difference, and that's what this is about.
In the book, one thing that you repeatedly return to is the concept of the hero's journey. And you describe the hero's journey as a universal story, but for veterans, it often feels reversed. It kind of begins with the structure and purpose of military service and then shifts into the ambiguity and unpredictability of civilian life. How did this perspective shape the way that you approached writing this book?
Yeah, we struggled with this and it ended up believing that it was actually absolutely essential. So for folks listening, the idea of the hero's journey is kind of a framework or a theory of how to look at epic tales of all time, current and ancient. And it breaks down these stories into, depending on how much detail you want, 3 essential steps. And that is the call to adventure, the leaving of home for the known world to the great unknown. Step 2 is this phase of tremendous adventure. It is also one involving tremendous service, sacrifice, loss, challenge, growth, grieving. And then the 3rd phase is coming home, but you've changed. Everything has changed, as Rob has said. And in that coming home, there is this enormous opportunity to look at your life, if you will, to reframe the picture of your life to yourself. Again, as Rob said, to come up with a narrative of your own life that is powerful, that is ennobling, that is noble. And the key to it that this narrative framework of the hero's journey provides is if you can understand for yourself the great experience, skills, life-changing aspects of your military experience and bring them in and synthesize them in your civilian life and bring those things with your civilian life to those around you, your friends, your family, your community, your country. And you can add value. You can be of service. You can lift people up. You can find a path in your life that combines these things. Then that gift you get upon coming back is of tremendous value. And it's often left on the table and not really focused on. I think for Rob and me in our own lives, we've had to grapple with that, but we saw that for the folks, the veterans and spouses that came back from this journey and saw that and took advantage of it, they had tremendous life opportunity. So the idea of the hero's journey, although it has some great details that are important to understand one's journey in life, but what it comes down to for this purpose is very simple, and that is How do you take advantage of these life experiences and skills and combine them in your civilian life in a powerful, uplifting way to refine meaning and purpose, fulfillment, joy, love, happiness? That is the power of it.
Yeah, Rob, when I think of that idea from the hero's journey of like leaving the known world, to me, as someone who hasn't served, I'd think, oh, that is clearly the transition from civilian life to military life. But can you speak to the idea of leaving the known world and how that concept resonates differently for veterans as they transition to civilian life?
Yes. As Alex and I looked at this, we looked at it as sometimes veterans, when they come back, we know there's the loss of identity, the loss of community, but sometimes through our experiences in this unknown world or service to country, this ambiguity that we serve through, especially through war and combat, sometimes veterans come back with the proverbial fog, not the fog of war, but the mental fog. And if they don't have the self-realization or a mentor to help them through to see these things, that they're not right, or they might, be off a little bit, they could be walking off the cliff into the abyss. And these are things I'm talking about: PTSD, TBI, physical injury, moral injury. These are the things that through our life of our career or service to country that we were exposed to, especially in combat. And so to come back to this known world, you have to have this self-realization that you may have to fix the self. And we also talk about Heracles circles of concern, to where if you want to go on and be a contributing or whole member within the family unit and the nexus of the families committing to the community, you have to fix the self first.
Alex, when you and Rob were writing this book, during the interview process where you interviewed, again, over 200 veterans and their spouses, was there a moment where a particular story from one of the veterans reshaped your understanding of reintegration?
It's a great question. And I would say there were many stories. I think the stories that captured us and moved us most were very heartfelt stories of people who had suffered great loss and found a way back, found a way to wholeness inside, and using that for meaning. And so one of the taglines that's come from this that we believe resonates with our own lives, Rob and my own lives, is from our greatest wounds comes our greatest purpose. There's the story of, I don't think he would be offended if we repeated it. He got some press about it. It's a story of a guy named Derek Herrera, who was a Marine in Afghanistan leading his platoon. And he was shot and paralyzed by a Taliban sniper. And he was bleeding heavily from multiple wounds. And he thought he was not going to make it. So he pulls out of his jacket a picture of his wife to say goodbye. While he then refocuses on his situation, he calls in medevacs to bring his guys out who are hurt. They save him. In his hospital bed, he is able to come up with an idea that I'm going to make it. I'm going to go to business school and learn some skills about a new world I don't know. I'm going to form companies that help people who have suffered spinal cord injuries. So it happens to me, but I don't have really kind of bad days anymore once I realize that this is what life's about. And this is the life opportunity if you can tune into it. We could tell you a dozen of those stories. These are heroic figures that transform anyone around them. And we hope to tell their stories. And frankly, on our website, which is heroes-journey.net, we invite people to tell their stories. We have posted pictures of people from before and after their service. We've told versions of their stories. There are dozens of them that are moving. And in our book, we try and tell these stories and have those stories be channeled for particular parts of our book. Our book is all about stories that are transforming, and I think transformed Rob's and my own sense of the scope of duty we have here.
I have to imagine, just hearing you share that story now, Alex, that in speaking with these veterans, that I imagine that part of it was therapeutic to simply tell their stories to people. Like, I have to imagine that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Rob. For some of these men and women who have been through often horrific, but in their actions, truly heroic moments where they made a difference in other people's lives and did truly important things or suffered great tragedy, I imagine that a lot of what these veterans carry around is the fact that they're carrying these stories and unable to share them with people, either because they don't want to burden their family members with it. Like, my grandfather obviously came from a different generation, but he would not talk about his time in World War II. He just wouldn't. And I imagine that, even in the 21st century, when we have all these resources that try and enable veterans to share these stories? Because oftentimes I imagine it's necessary from a therapeutic point of view that it can be difficult to discuss these with people, either because you don't want to feel like you're burdening your family with your trauma. But I imagine that just talking with the two of you and being able to speak to someone about what they've gone through was in and of itself very worthwhile.
Alex, do you want to answer first and then I can?
Yeah.
I have a little bit different take having lived through that.
Yeah. So, Michael, you've hit the nail on the head again. I think almost every conversation was therapeutic or cathartic for the veteran in many ways, including some famous folks who shared personal stories, as well as folks that are not famous that are enlisted that engaged in this process. I think the one that I would refer to first that we both found powerful and moving was the story of Daniel Cortez, who was a private in a Marine company in Vietnam. He was 18, and his CEO was a guy named Corky Ram, who was the father of a mentor of mine from my work. That's how we got to Cortez, through my mentor, who helped us with finding her dad's posse, as she calls them. One day, a call went out that there were 2 Marines from their company trapped and were about to be overrun by Army of North Vietnam regulars, and the helicopters got ready, and Cortez, he was up, and Major Ram put his hand in his face and said, "No, you're going back. There's not space for both of us. I'm taking this one." Major Ram then directs the mission, saves the men. These 2 guys come back, and he's killed. And the entire regiment was devastated because Cortez described Ram as the ultimate selfless American hero. He was a father to every kid in the company. Everyone looked up to him, senior, junior, peer. And he did the unthinkable. And I have carried this burden with me for 58 years, he told us. And he described what that meant. And he described finding the courage to go visit the Ram family and go to the gravesite and to have some healing together. And then what he described was what he did with this and the lessons he learned and the companies and impact he built. Here's someone who, again, took tremendous burden and grieving and turned it into something. And this conversation was enormously important for us. And he told us it was valuable to him. And that is maybe a powerful story, but I can tell you that it was common in our interview experience. And we want people, by the way, to contribute their stories to our website. We want to tell people's stories. So the answer to your question, Michael, is a big yes.
And Rob?
Yeah, so Alex has a unique perspective because he's sat and listened to these folks, the interviews and these stories. I'm from the other side of this, and this is why it was such a great partnership to write this book, is I lived through this. Through 5 tours overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan, I saw countless traumas. I've been to more funerals than I probably care to want to talk about. Loss of my roommate through SEAL training, Lieutenant Brendan Looney, another good friend, Charles Keating. We lost 5 guys on my last deployment. Feeks, Warson. I've lost numerous friends just in training. Seth Lewis, Brett Merrihew, a couple other guys. So I've lived through this, all of this. So it was very therapeutic to go back, even after my own help that I had to get through a couple of clinics and finding a Marine Corps era Vietnam vet who's a psychologist. He's worked with vets for 40 years. He helped me tie all this together. And it was kind of serendipitous as I was finishing my work with him is when I met Alex. So this was really allowing me to put, the 2 programs and the therapy and being therapeutic to now write about it, having lived all this.
You write in the book that, quote, the recognition of veterans' experiences by the community and the country itself is critical and historically has had a positive impact on how veterans return and reintegrate, end quote. And to the points that the 2 of you have just made, how can we as civilians better fulfill that role, Alex?
Well, that's kind of the ultimate end question, I think. I'll begin with a little bit of theory, which I hate to do, and then get to specifics. We have, because of the founding of our country and the founding constitutional principles of the structure of our country and what that means for how we live, we have an obligation to each other. There is a social contract that exists. You may not be in favor of a particular military conflict. You may have voted against it in some way, but we have an obligation, once the decision's made, to send young men and women into danger, to support them and to love them and to be practical and helpful. So thanking a veteran for his or her service, yeah, that's okay. But if it's, thank you for your service, we're going to let you deal with your wounds of war on your own, good luck, which is sometimes what the impact is, notwithstanding the intent, then that's not okay, that's not enough. There's a lot we can do. And some of this needs leadership at the local level. Some of it is just common sense. What we have found, and this is an ancient ritual, is that veterans speaking with each other, and we can tell you many, many stories about it, and hearing those stories is essential. Give you a really short example. There was a Boston VA psychiatrist named Shea who wrote books about veteran healing and their journeys based on Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And he took 500 Marines to a theater in Cambridge, Massachusetts to watch a play called Ajax, written about veterans coming back from the Persian Wars. And it had to do with a veteran suicide at the end. So when I heard this story, I'm like, are you kidding? Getting 500 veteran Marines into a theater, what would that be like? And apparently, once the play started, you could hear a pin drop. And apparently, at the end, when this terrible tragedy occurred, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. So this is a story emblematic. Veterans need to speak with each other. There's an untold and unspoken bond that need not be articulated, that is a basis of that sharing and communication and testimony. That's critical, and we should be fostering that. Sebastian Junger, who's a very famous and compelling journalist who's been a great supporter of ours behind the scenes, created a nonprofit called Vets Town Hall for veterans to do that. There's many others. That's a phenomenal one. The step that goes beyond that, both in the community context and also in the work context, in our work with companies today, is when veterans understand that the civilians sitting next to them actually can hear their story, and we can see each other as having had very different life experiences. Think about how Rob and I have worked together for 5 years. And I think we have found this partnership amazing, that once you expand that to the non-veteran, and when a non-veteran organizes a hike with veterans and others to share that, to hear their stories, for them to hear our stories, then it becomes powerful. That's something everyone can do. The stories of how veterans were welcomed back from World War II, you spoke about your grandfather, are many. The story of the greatest generation, written by Brokaw, allows one to understand in a very practical, concrete way that those veterans came back to a society that knew in some way possible for their imagination what they had gone through. Nothing like the Vietnam experience, where we dishonored our obligation to veterans and spat on them. I mean, it's just shameful history we have in our country about that. The understanding of veterans and their coming back is essential. That is something that has been an essential part of warrior societies in our country, in Native American societies across the world. And in those societies, the civilians are the ones that initiate and welcome that, often because of the modesty of the warriors. And in that, there is an interchange and a learning, and we civilians are the ones that benefit from their wisdom and their life stories. A snippet of that would be when Senator John McCain told the Senate and the Congress, we need to understand what's involved in going to war before we send our young men and women into war. That happened because of his life experience and his family history. These are all things we as civilians can understand better and go do. There's a long list of other things which our book details, and also there's one book in particular by Dr. Edward Tick that lists this and talks about it. So we as civilians have an enormous duty, and there's very many practical things we can do to fulfill that obligation.
Rob, the book discusses how veterans' experiences can offer wisdom to society. And I just wanted to know from your perspective, what's an example of this wisdom that those of us who haven't served may not appreciate, may not see, may not understand? And what are some ways we can integrate this wisdom, this knowledge into civilian life?
I think as a veteran and having served in the way I did for the country, there's great lessons to learn both in success and failure. And some of the things that we bring forward is we have this unrelentless drive to succeed. And I know our ethos is quite long within the community, but the common man with the uncommon desire to succeed. If we have the right purpose and mission aligned, there's no task in front of us that we cannot accomplish. So I think it's in applying the grit, the uncommon grit from the adversities that we've been through, the ability to be highly adaptable and versatile and to be dropped almost into any situation. There's a few that kind of stick out in my mind.
I have a copy of Meditations on my nightstand. So the two quotes from Marcus Aurelius in your book jumped out at me. The first one is, quote, "The happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts," end quote. And the other is, quote, "Choose not to be harmed and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed and you haven't been," end quote. I just want to know how those quotes came to be in the book.
Yes, I believe we were both familiar. I think Alex probably more intimate with his undergrad studies in philosophy or ancient Greek. But I would say we were both aware of that. But also, there's a lot of literature that we did not know, that we handed each other's books and we were able to craft the narrative in writing this. Alex, did you feel the same?
100%.
Yeah. I, like many, probably became most familiar with Aurelius and the Stoics through Ryan Holiday. And I was just curious how, and this is a question for both of you, how has Stoicism been helpful in your own lives? And what lessons do you feel this philosophy may hold for veterans?
Wow, that's a big one. Well, there's several key components, and the works of Aurelius and the other main Stoic authors that we have today have been essential guideposts in our family. I say that as aspiration. We seek to live up to those standards. It's hard to do that all the time. But the idea that you don't control what happens to you, you don't control circumstances around you, but you do control your reaction to it. You do control your emotions and what you allow yourself to do. And that's not to say you put your emotions in a box and forget about them. Emotions are essential in life's navigation. In fact, the language and journey of the heart is an essential part of healing that we talk about. Having said that, Tony Robbins has adapted and artfully stolen the idea that these things happen for us, not to us. General Mattis, who apparently carried the meditations in his rucksack into every major engagement he went into, speaks about this, that if you look at your life as things you can learn and grow from, even if they're not particularly fun, and you grow and learn and become bigger and better and stronger and aligned with your mission, you are doing what you're supposed to do, and I would say you're also blessed. Stoic lessons and philosophy filter throughout our book, although we don't want to be preaching about it. So the short answer is I think you've hit on essential aspects of it that we think are very important for life, that we want to share. We want to share them in a way that reflects our recognition that we have failed more than we have succeeded in life, and we want to share that with our readers.
One of the most fundamental parts of Stoicism that's connected with me is reframing what happens to us and how that is a very powerful thing we can do. There was a quote in the book, quote, "This is part of the nobility of the warrior, their ability to bear their wounds well and to see their scars as carrying a beauty that comes only with sacrifice for their brothers and sisters, community and country," end quote. And that phrase really stuck with me. Bear their wounds well and to see their scars as carrying a beauty that comes only with sacrifice for their brothers and sisters. And it just, to go back to the Stoicism part, Alex, it's like how we choose, and I'm using we very loosely here, but how any of us choose to frame traumatic events, to frame what we've been through in a positive manner, I imagine is very empowering.
It's enormously empowering. The lines you read came from Sitting Bull in one of the last interviews or discussions of his life. And as an aside, there's probably 6 other Native American warriors that we refer to in our book. I think the power and the beauty of those words speak for themselves. It goes to a way of looking at your own life, and as you say, Michael, reframing your life in a way that, it's an overused phrase, but it's real, is empowering and gives you a sense of the nobility and purpose of your life and what you have to contribute to others, to serve others, because ultimately a profound sense of purpose, and everyone can find their own. But for us, and the thrust of the veterans and the spouses in this book, is serving a cause higher or transcendent, and serving something bigger than yourself with the scars you have suffered becomes part of your story. And so you're describing it as reframing, and that's a good way to do it. That is very much a part of this self-narrative that Rob talked about at the beginning of our conversation. It's an essential insight into the Stoic view that you also quoted about it's what you do with it that matters. And it's not just what you do with it. Of course, that's true. It's also that as we go through our journeys in life, and this is, again, the hero's journey theme, that looking upon the scars we have had to bear, whether physical or non-physical, is a way to account for ourselves and to have that have meaning, to have that have served a purpose. So you're touching on a really kind of critical, soulful element of our book.
Rob, was there a moment as you were transitioning into civilian life that you had to, I mean, you talk about that 2-year period after you left the military. Was there a story that happened to you? Was there an event that happened to you during your service that you had to reframe? And once you reframed that narrative, you found either a solace or a peace or a wholeness that might not have been present before? Is that too personal of a question, or is that something that you feel comfortable?
No, not too personal. And I hope what I say that kind of gives other folks meaning and other vets a chance to step back and reflect. The answer to your question is there was not one single event. It was almost all events, because I've become so good at compartmentalizing all the deaths from friends in combat and everything that I experienced over there, and coming back and going through psych evals and, just saying, yep, I'm good. Because I didn't want to be on the sideline, just like no one else. Didn't want to have my security clearance pulled or any of that. And so all those things, they all were lying subsurface there. And coming out and losing the identity, losing the community, we're good, but we're not that good. We cannot compartmentalize like that. And those things start to spill over into our normal life. And if you don't go seek help and get those things fixed, or even just talk to someone through these things, or have a mentor to guide you through these, they start affecting all parts of your life.
I can only relate in my own very small way, which is back in 2008, 2009, when I had my first experience with depression, that I put off going to therapy for 4 years because the story that I told in my head was that, well, the kind of person who needs therapy is like a broken person, and you're not a broken person, so why would you need therapy? And I would imagine, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Rob, that voice or that narrative is intensified when you're a SEAL, or when you're someone who is looked at as this pillar of strength, or look at this badass going in and doing these things that most men and women could never even think of doing. I would imagine that squaring the need, the desire for help and assistance with what perhaps is the image of the SEAL, the image of the military service member, that squaring those two things and realizing that, no, it is okay to seek help is something that can maybe take some time to wrestle with.
You're absolutely right. And it really comes down to us not being honest with ourselves. And what is the reason that's holding us back from going and seeking that help? Is that, fear of distancing someone, or not being loved, or not having the self-love, or not being being seen in a different light, that you are vulnerable, or you're not this, as you put it, the Hollywood badass that everybody's portrayed with the movies and the books. Another thing that we learned in speaking with some psychiatrists is, if you go over there and you've experienced combat, and I would say broader, if you've been exposed to things in the military, but it's a Venn diagram. You have depression, survivor's guilt on the outside. In the middle, you have PTSD, and they all blend together. And clinically, if you hit 4 of the diagnoses or characteristic points for PTSD, you're deemed to have PTSD. But every veteran falls kind of within this Venn diagram somewhere from what they've been experienced. And the more extreme the combat, or the more, the repetitions of how many rotations they did overseas, the harder it's going to be to come back and deal with these things.
There's a great quote, "We're all broken. That's how the light gets in." That's from Hemingway.
That's a great one.
I don't think you have to have a particular religious faith to understand that. I think in my own life, in the beginning, because of how many men are trained in a 2-dimensional image of what it means to be a man, talking about emotions and getting therapy were things I resisted. That's human. But these are things that, in the words of Tom Satterley, who is a hero by anyone's measure, military and especially non-military aspects of his life, these are ways to get bigger and stronger. These are not cries of, "I am weak." It's the opposite. It is the strong person who can go get help. And sometimes it takes a bit to get there. That's pretty human.
Yes, it is. And it goes back to the earlier point, which is that while this book might be geared towards veterans and their spouses and families, like, this is a universal theme. Whether you have served or not, the narratives that we struggle with in our own minds, the things that keep us from getting help, the problems that we have, that we all struggle through our own ways, whether we have served or not, is something that I think everyone can relate to. And again, I think it speaks to the quality and consideration of this book. The fact that I, as someone who, has never served, was able to go through this book and find wisdom that I could use in my own life that was helpful for me to your credit, gentlemen, you could have written a book that was much more specific and much more alienating to people who had not served. And I can really tell that you went above and beyond out of your way to make sure that this was a book that was accessible to everybody. And you made it truly universal. And for that, I am very grateful. Alex, what does a society look like that fully values and integrates the stories and strengths of its veterans?
We live a bigger, more wholehearted life. We live a life of a greater degree of honor and integrity on an individual, community, and country level. It's very simple. That's what it is to me. And if I don't get a chance, I would add as a final word for the folks listening, this is a tough journey for many. And there's many points when any of us in our life journeys have wanted to give up. And what we would tell you from the wisdom from hundreds of others is we hope you never give up. There is room and opportunity for hope and inspiration. There are new therapies that are new this year, that are new in the last 10 years that did not exist before. And we hope that people, when they have a dark day, can hold on to that and get help or find a way to find strength, because there's always a reason for hope and inspiration.
And Rob, what is something you would say to a veteran who might be listening to this conversation, who might be on the fence of whether or not they think this book is right for them?
I think that going back and you look at your time in the military service, everything we did was to prepare for a training event, real-time operation, or you're going to war. Why would you not train to get out and go through a massive life transition? And I think that's where I don't want to say it's not hubris, but we sit back and was like, we rest too much on of our experiences, what we've been through. We've been pressure tested. We've gone through tremendous adversity, and we think we can take things head on and not have to go do the work and that everything is going to be fine. But this is brand new terrain getting out, and you will experience stress. Why would you not want to mitigate the stress you're about to go through?
I'll end with something you said earlier in this conversation, Alex. From our greatest wounds come our greatest purpose. And I am so grateful that you both have modeled this in your own work with this book, that you have taken your pain and put it to good use for others. So thank you so much for this book. It is filled with such specific, empathetic, detailed advice. And thank you again for your time today.
Michael, thank you. Great talking to you.
Thank you.